Welcome back to The Haunted Beard, everybody. My name is Jake. Thank you for joining me. Today, I want to give you my review on one of my all-time favorite horror movies, and that is Saint Maud. This is a psychological, religious horror movie starring Morfydd Clark, directed by Rose Glass. It was her feature film directorial debut. And this is just a fantastic film, so I want to get into my thoughts on it. Let's do it. So Saint Maud tells the story of Maud, a pious nurse who becomes dangerously obsessed with saving the soul of her dying patient. There's a lot going on and a lot to unpack in the film's 85-minute runtime. It opens up and we are introduced to Maud. She is a nurse and she's in a hospital room, sitting in a corner, totally exhausted, defeated, covered in blood, and then we find out that there is a dead patient on a gurney. Seemingly something very traumatic and awful just occurred. She looks up and sees what looks to be a beetle crawling on the ceiling, and that is our opening scene in our introduction to our main character. Now, in terms of background context, that is really all we get in terms of what is visually presented to us, and for the most part, what is explained. That scene is referenced a couple times throughout the rest of the movie, including one scene later on where you do catch a couple extra glimpses of what transpired. But for the most part, Saint Maud starts off on a very sort of ominous and disturbing and yet very sort of restrained and mysterious note. Oftentimes, I'm not a fan of flashbacks in movies because I feel like a lot of times they are very cheap and lazy writing techniques to just kind of fill in the audience. I would rather just have information present itself organically through the events of the movie. And so they just sometimes feel like a very sort of cheap ploy to give us information. And so I like that this film gives you just a very sort of subtle clue to start the film, and then we start our story from there. And you're kind of left sort of wondering what exactly that meant, and you're kind of left, trying to figure out and fill in the pieces throughout the rest of the movie. I just like that the film doesn't spoon feed you the answers. It doesn't give you a very clear-cut, obvious explanation for everything. I think the more subtle, mysterious approach is the way to go. After this, we see Maud present day in her little apartment. She lives alone in this small little apartment, and she is this very shy, quiet, reserved individual. She is now still a nurse, but is doing in-person or in-home care. She's suffering from some kind of abdominal pain. And we also learn very quickly about her that her religious beliefs and her faith is something that is very prominent and very important to her as she starts off praying to God to reveal his plans to her as she wants to be a part of something more than what she is currently doing. She then goes to her new patient's home where she's taking over the in-care duties for the previous nurse, and we are introduced to Amanda, played by Jennifer Ehle, and she is a former dancer who is still fairly young and is now dying of cancer. We learn that Maud has just recently converted to her faith, and that sometimes when she prays, she claims to feel God's presence, and she has these episodes where she feels this very warm, pulsing, pleasurable sensation throughout her body, and she interprets that as the presence of God. And it's here where the movie starts slowly and gradually becoming something a little more sinister and a little darker as we kind of are gradually introduced more and more into Maud's psyche and her mental state. And I believe this film ultimately becomes a portrait of a woman who is very mentally unwell. And it starts off small enough where Amanda has these people come over that she basically just uses for sex. And Maud finds out about this and she attempts to run one of them off because she thinks that it's just a complete waste of her time. And so Maud begins really trying to save Amanda's soul by ultimately lying to her, manipulating her, and really trying to just control her behavior. And so as I've said, I think this is a movie ultimately about a portrait of a woman who is very unwell. But I think this movie is as much about mental health and the psychological horror as it is as much about religious horror. It's this woman who is suffering from past trauma and what turn out to be seemingly these delusions, but it's all expressed within this sort of religious horror type context. I think Morfydd Clark's performance here is just fantastic, as she just carries the entire film. She creates this very, I think, intimate sort of portrayal of this woman who is just slowly losing her mind. And as I mentioned earlier, I enjoy that the movie isn't over-explanatory. There's a lot of things that are still not entirely explained. And so there's this kind of mysterious and ambiguous aspect to it. We don't entirely know what happened in Maud's past to lead to this type of outcome. There's a scene that occurs later on where Maud is out walking in the town and bumps into one of her old nurse friends that she used to work with, and the nurse calls her Katie. And so there's just this kind of small layer that is peeled back to where, okay, she had this past life where she's going by this different name. She had this different identity, and now she is somebody else. What exactly happened there? About halfway through the film, Amanda confronts Maud with the lies that she's been telling, and everything kind of blows up right there. And Maud ends up slapping Amanda and then leaves, and she ends up getting fired and loses her job. And there's this scene that occurs not long after that scene where Maud is asking God, why are you punishing me? She thinks and believes that God is punishing her, that he's just doing it out of spite, and she starts questioning God's motives and his character. And she sees herself as such this loyal and obedient servant, and she can't understand why God is punishing her. And I can't help but think of the story of Job in the Bible, as I think that there is a connection there, as Job kind of went through something similar where he was also questioning God's character and wondering why God is punishing him and why all these bad things are happening to him. So I think there's a little bit of an inspiration, or at least a connection to be made from Maud's character and the character of Job, at least during that part of the movie. And Maud ultimately ends up going back to her old ways. She goes back to the bar, she gets drunk, she looks for men to hook up with, and she is just this lonely, sad, miserable person who doesn't have anybody, who is desiring some type of connection, but there's no real connection there. She is just completely and totally alone. And not only is Maud suffering from mental delusions, I also think she's suffering from some religious delusions as well, as she is feeling deeply shameful. And she has this expectation or understanding of God that if she just does enough, or works hard enough, prays the right way, does the right things in the right way, that she will feel God's presence again, that he will somehow allow her back into good standings, that she will get this, that warm sensation again, that she will be blessed. And she's just going about sort of trying to earn God's favor in this very ultimately destructive and harmful way. Not long after this, we get another effective scene where Maud prays to God and she gets that sensation again. In fact, she feels it so overwhelming that she begins to levitate right there in her own apartment. And really, it's a horribly tragic scene, because she kind of uses that sensation as this sort of confirmation bias that, oh, she must be on the right track. And she uses that to understand that she's doing the right thing. She's gotten this new sort of revelation. She knows she's on the right track and doing the right thing. But again, she still feels shame, so she believes she has to pay some sort of penance for her behavior. And then at about an hour in, we get what is probably the most sort of subjective, up to interpretation scene in the movie, where the cockroach appears to her again on the ceiling, and it crawls down through her apartment and goes underneath her little dresser drawer. And then there's this sort of weird kind of ripply effect, and then someone begins to speak to her. And it seems pretty certain to me that Maud interprets it as the voice of God. However, we as the audience, I'm not so sure that that's exactly who it is. Now, I think you could make a case that it isn't God. It is, in fact, the devil, which to me is an extremely scary thought. And as I spoke a minute ago about, not only is there this mental delusion, but a religious delusion as well. And I can't think of too many things scarier than being so convinced and so absolutely certain that you are on a mission from God and doing God's work, but you're so deluded that you are not doing God's work. You're in fact doing the work of the devil. And it turns out, seemingly, that that's exactly what's happening here. Now, I think that is one interpretation. I also think you could interpret the beetle and the voice that speaks to her as this further sort of confirmation of just her, again, deteriorating mental state, of her delusions just continually, getting worse and worse. So is the cockroach the devil? Is it just this sort of representation of this, this sickness, so to speak, that got into her mind and again just sort of started her downhill trajectory towards, where she is now? There's a brief scene that occurs not long after this where her old nurse friend Joy shows up at the apartment. And I really just bring this scene up because it gives us just another very brief glimpse into Maud's background, where Joy references the incident that occurred with the patient that, again, we see at the beginning of the film. And she also tells us that Maud had been struggling prior to that event as well. And so, again, there's more history there. We don't really understand it all. We certainly aren't given a full picture of it. We're given very, very little information, but we just know that there's a whole lot that we don't see that is ultimately feeding into and adding up to what we are now seeing regarding Maud and what she's experiencing and dealing with. Ultimately, Maud determines that her God-given mission is to go save Amanda's life before she dies. And we get one of the best scenes in the film where she really breaks into Amanda's home at night to confront her and talk to her. And Amanda says something that I think is very key and speaks into Maud's character. She says, "You are the loneliest girl I've ever seen," which I think is totally and completely true. Perhaps that is just one of the contributing factors to, again, Maud's deteriorating mental state. But the way this scene plays out, I think, is just fantastic, and it leads to one of the scariest and most terrifying moments. But ultimately, Amanda confesses to Maud that she had been lying to Maud as well regarding sort of her religious experiences that they supposedly shared together earlier on in the film. And she just tells Maud that, there is no God. When she dies, that's it. There's nothing. And Maud doesn't take that too well, and she realizes that Amanda is a lost cause. She realizes that she can't save her. And so to me, what her mind does in order to cope with this is she turns Amanda into a literal demon. And man, when Amanda turns into a demon, holy smokes, it still scares the crap out of me. It's absolutely terrifying, but I love that. And again, it just kind of speaks to Maud's deteriorating mind, to where she's being hit with something that she interprets as this sort of traumatic thing. Basically, she's being told that, hey, Maud, everything you believe in is a complete lie. And so in order to cope with this, her brain manifests this scenario that turns Amanda into a demon, and Maud ends up stabbing her and killing her with a pair of scissors. And so just a fantastically directed scene. Rose Glass does an awesome job, brings a legitimate scare. At least it got me when she turns into that demon, man, is freaked the crap out of me. And then we get the finale, and oh my goodness, that ending has seared itself into my brain. I will never forget it, especially the first time I watched it. Man, it left me shook. Obviously, Maud goes out to the beach wearing her cloak or her robe, whatever you want to call it, dressed like a saint, right? Goes out to the beach, pours the gallon of liquid over her, and lights herself on fire. And it's portrayed through Maud's eyes, as she is this saint and she is this beacon of light, and she sees the people on the beach kneeling down before her as if she's being elevated to this heavenly saint-like status. And right before the film cuts to black, you get about 10 frames where the delusion drops, reality sets in, and you see her burning alive, and then boom, credits roll. And oh my goodness, it's so shocking and effective and horrifying, and it's a perfect ending. I think it's just absolutely fantastic. And so, yeah, Saint Maud, man, it is a fantastic film. I love the combination of the psychological horror about just mental health combined with the religious horror elements as well. And like I said, I think ultimately this is the portrait of a very unwell woman sort of being expressed in a religious context. And I cannot wait for Rose Glass's next film, which is going to be coming out later this year, Love Lies Bleeding. Very much looking forward to it. So those are my thoughts on Saint Maud. Hit me up down below. Let me know your thoughts on the film. Also, too, let me know your kind of interpretation and how you understand the trauma of Maud's past, and what you think the beetle represents, and how you interpret that scene of the thing or someone speaking to her. Let me know. Would love to hear your thoughts. So that's all I got for you. Thank you so much for watching. I greatly appreciate it, and I'll see you next time on The Haunted Beard.